The Charlie Parker that I know is a very different type of Charlie Parker.
Yes, there is some natural confusion that arises, I think.
How often do people ask you that question?
Occasional disaffected jazz fans who are looking for a refund, I think, having erroneously bought a book that they thought would feature a lot of jazz and doesn't. Not as often now. I mean, the original idea was that his name, I like the evocations of his nickname, because Charlie Parker, the jazz musician, was known as Bird. And I liked the idea of a man who is so mired in mortality, is so earthbound, having a name associated with flight and freedom and spirituality, I suppose. I like that collision, I suppose. I don't use the nickname very often in the books anymore because I was worried people would think it was a gimmick and it wasn't meant to be that way. There was a sound reason for doing it at the beginning.
Were you aware of the implication of the choice when you started the series?
It was quite a conscious decision. I mean, it's one of the big decisions that writers take if they're going to do a series. Not that you think you're going to do a series. I mean, most writers don't imagine that they're going to be published, and the ones who believe that they're going to be published probably shouldn't be. It's like wanting to be a politician. That should immediately rule you out, okay? But you have a kind of hope, I suppose, that you will be published and that perhaps there will be a continuation allowed. And so I think most writers probably spend quite a lot of time trying to figure out what this central character is going to be called and whether their name is going to have a particular meaning. Because if things go well, you're going to be stuck with him. You don't want to call him Betty. You know, that's not really going to work, you know.
So what sort of personality lives inside you? Is it the same one that is inside Charlie Parker?
I think every writer writes a little bit about themselves, but I remember once interviewing James Lee Burke, and Burke said that he thought he was mainly the good people in his books, that the bad ones didn't really have a whole lot to do with them. And I think I've given every sin I've ever committed to somebody in my books. So I think as a writer you put a little bit of yourself into every character. I mean, there may be more of you in that central character, or what you think is more of yourself. But at the same time, especially if you're writing a series like I do, but I think any central character in a book, fiction is refractive, it's not reflective. It's a way of, it does the same thing a prism does, which is that it refracts experience. Well, prism refracts light, fiction refracts experience. And I think central characters tend to work as prisms. They tend to be ways for writers to refract experience and see it in a different way. So they're not really you, but they're aspects of you, and they allow you to see the world through a slightly different set of eyes, I think.
Is John Connolly a burning soul?
No, I'm not that interesting. I think most writers aren't. Our characters are more interesting than we are. But who wasn't? Wasn't it one of your cohorts who said that you had to be dull in your real life so that you could be radical in your art? And I think maybe we live out a kind of different life through our books. We ourselves. I wouldn't want to be as tormented as he is. I wouldn't want to be as difficult as he is. But there are aspects of him that are my personality magnified slightly, I think.
What makes Burning Soul different from your other books?
As a writer, you hope that you get a little bit better each time, or not even that you get better necessarily, but that you don't make the same mistakes you made in earlier books. What happens is you make a whole different set of mistakes.
So here you have to clarify, because better means what in your terms?
Well, I agree that the difficulty is that the criteria that readers judge you on are not necessarily the same criteria that you use for yourself. I've had readers say to me that they didn't like Burning Soul because it wasn't violent enough. And I noticed that progressively my books will probably be becoming less violent as the years go by. I think you realize that less is more, and you use it quite selectively so that it has a particular impact. And I suppose the subject matter, tackling slightly more difficult psychological subject matter.
What is the subject matter of Burning Soul?
Well, The Burning Soul is about a young man, or a man who in his teenage years accidentally killed a girl. He and his friend attacked a girl, and this assault grew out of control. She fought back and she died. And it is it came out of there had been a murder of a young boy in Bootle near Liverpool quite some time ago. A little boy named James Bulger, and the two boys who killed him were not much older than he was. I think they had not yet reached their teens. And unlike in the US, where children are jailed indefinitely for crimes that they committed in their youth, in Britain you have to allow people who've committed crimes before the age of 18, they have to be allowed to go free once they reach an adult stage. And one of the killers of James Bulger found himself back in the news again because he had been found with child pornography on his computer, which was a breach of the terms of his release, and he was going to be put back in jail. What they had to do to save these two teenage boys, or formerly teenage boys, from being attacked by angry mobs was that they had to give them entirely new identities. They had to relocate them somewhere else and say, you can never return to the streets you grew up on. You can never see the relatives that you knew then there. You can never walk in the parks and on those streets again. And I remember thinking I would collapse under that kind of psychological pressure. I'm an adult, and if somebody said to me, for whatever reason, you have to go somewhere else and not return to any of those places you knew, that because you are a product of your environment, I would have found it very difficult, and I was not surprised.
What's at stake? What's the loss? Is it some kind of entity?
Well, what I think in the case of these kids, or kids as was that they never had any time to establish an identity. They committed a crime before they were teenagers. They spent their teenage years, their formative years, locked up entirely, and being prepared for a moment when they would be released as entirely different human beings. I don't think they have an identity. I wouldn't. And so it was about, I suppose, are we always going to be defined by the sins we've committed, even as adults? Because I think sometimes as adults we judge ourselves by the things we've done wrong, the things we could take back. I think adult lives are products of regret.
The Charlie Parker series, the central themes is about grief and guilt.
Yeah.
And again, it would seem that in Burning Soul, the same themes are underlying in echo again.
Well, I think most writers only have a small number of themes that they come back to over and over, and it doesn't matter whether you're a genre writer or a writer of literary fiction. You circle, it's like a spiral. Through your career, you come closer and closer to this thing at the core. And in Parker there's a certain amount of how does one overcome grief? How does one live with guilt? But also, it's about redemption. The novels I love, the writers I love, the characters I admire in mystery fiction are all individuals seeking redemption, and we achieve redemption by acting on behalf of others. That's how redemption is achieved. And to do that requires an element of self-sacrifice. It requires an extraordinary capacity for empathy, for the recognition of suffering in others. So I think the Parker novels would be very dark and bleak if it wasn't that throughout them there is this man who is attempting to achieve redemption, who has the hope that he can do it. I'm not sure the belief that it's going to happen, but the hope that he might be forgiven, and that in doing so he might forgive himself.